Welcome to the Chess Channel, the channel where you can learn loads. The game we are about to cover is from the ongoing Top Chess Engine Championship, which round now is in its Premier League stage. The two top engines from this league will meet in the superfinal, which will be subjected to 100 games. If they end up in a tie, something that has never happened before, we shall see the two finalist engines go into shorter time controls. This game today stands out by a clear mile, and let me tell you why. The mid-game, Rubichess was up on points with a bishop and knight versus a rook. What followed was simply magnificent, and we shall come to that point when we get to it. Before we say anything else, this game also stands out for another reason too. This is the only game being won by an engine taking the other side of the board to date. In a way, it is quite unique. There are plenty of things to learn, but you need to be an advanced player. Okay, now that we mentioned the important aspects from this game, let's get underway. This game is the one from round 36, and we hope you will see all the details that matter when they appear, which is just about now. What we are going to look at is the opening 2 and the opening book used in this game. Rubichess rated at 3508 should be no match for Stockfish that is rated at 3666, but given normally engines with the white pieces do get to have some advantage in the opening, let's see if this is the case today. Rubichess shot off with 1. e4. Stockfish answers with e5. And with this pawn pushed to the 4th, we get to see the king's gambit. Stockfish accepted the gambit. Rubichess develops the kingside knight to prevent the queen from coming in with a check, and what follows next is quite normal in the king's gambit. Stockfish came up with this push to g5. h4 followed, and with Stockfish now hunting after the knight, Rubichess jumps the knight into the center of the board. Knight f6 led to this push in the center, and at this point in time, the book ends. Stockfish, from the word go, went on to attack the knight. Rubichess backs off the knight to safety. And here is the moment where Stockfish arrests this pawn in the center. What we have so far is that Stockfish appears to have developed a bit more than Rubichess. Other than the pawn on d6, there are two pawns on the 4th and a knight parked next to them. Rubichess has a pawn on d4, another one on h4, and a knight on a rather awkward spot on the chessboard. With the knight on d3 and the bishop on c1, this pawn is on f4 is about to be taken, but with what minor piece would you take? Rubichess used the bishop. Stockfish could come up with this queen move, but after bishop e2 and knight c6, the game would take its normal course. However, rather than queen e7, Stockfish came up with the attack. Rather than the normal c3 that you would get to see, Rubichess challenged the knight instead. With takes and takes, Stockfish castled. Rubichess covers the access to the king in this way, and with the kingside knight coming now into the game. In case we forgot to mention what opening line we experienced, what we saw was the Rubinstein variation in the king's gambit accepted. Rubichess is in fact quite an unpredictable engine. It decided to castle here, but isn't this move going to allow this very important pawn to drop? Furthermore, should Stockfish be tempted to take this pawn, and is there an advantage? We are going to find out. Stockfish in the end did not take this pawn. What the engine did was to shoot off with this pawn to try and hold on to this pawn on g4. Rubichess was the first engine to create an attack on the queen. The engine directed the bishop against her. Stockfish here calculated best to reposition the queen to safety. And now via this queen repositioning by Rubichess, Stockfish finally gets the knight to jump into this outpost. Where is the knight going next, and why? The idea is simple. With the pawn on f5, Stockfish without a shadow of a doubt will want to park this knight right into e4, but this is only if Rubichess allows it. The engine calculated best not to permit the knight to reposition into e4, and by trading the bishop to the knight, Stockfish captures using the bishop. With the bishop now on f6, his next destination is h4. Rubichess without any hesitation covered for the pawn in this way. We can already see that both engines have opened gaps on their kingside, and this might a sign for something. Is it what engine finds their way through to the opposition first, and what engine is more precise in their attacking calculation? From what we can see here, Rubichess appears to have a very strong presence in the center. The knight on d3 is flexible, but the bishop on e2 is a bit locked in, and the rook on f1 right now is not all that well positioned. Stockfish does not appear to have a much better position. His bishop on c8 is out of play, the other bishop on g7 is restricted, the knight on d7 has only b6 and f6, and the rook on f8 is no better than the counter rook on f1. Having said this, Stockfish's queen on e8 does appear to stand better than that queen on d1. What side is better and what engine looks more threatening? This is a question we hopefully will be able to answer shortly. Rubichess saw a potential danger appearing with h6 and in this light opted for this queen repositioning. It is not certain Rubichess will end up a worse position if the engine allows the attack on the bishop. For example, rather than queen d2, if knight f4, should the bishop come under fire, there is bishop c4 check, king h7, rook e1, and knight e5. If you now take the knight, should the bishop also fall? If you now take the pawn on g5, remove this pawn on e5 with the bishop, and still neither engine appears to have made any real progress. Coming back, after queen d2, Stockfish, as we know, got the knight to find this outpost, and after the bishop was handed over to the knight, after g3, this is how Stockfish tries to make progress. Knight f4 resulted to this bishop response, and now Stockfish is looking really good. Rubichess here came up with a really interesting move. The engine attacked this pawn on the 7th, but with Stockfish blocking the attack in this way, Rubichess calculated best and found a way to neutralize this bishop on d7. The engine first considered king safety and opted for this king response. Was this the right move to go for, and why did the engine consider the king to be safer on h2? If this king response was a bit weird, what do make of the move Stockfish opted for? Stockfish 2 resulted to putting the king right into the edge of the chessboard. With the two kings on the same file once again, Rubichess sought out to neutralize the potential of this bishop on d7. The engine came in with this challenge. Stockfish rejects the challenge by attacking this bishop, and with Rubichess now returning the bishop where he stood earlier. Does this mean Rubichess has suffered a loss of tempo? This game lasted 81 moves, and it will be impossible to try and explain every single response. We shall try and cover, however, the most critical moves. b5 from Stockfish led to the knight to back off to the second. Stockfish 2 does the same with his bishop. And what this move allowed was for Rubichess to be able to sneak in his queen right into this outpost. Rubichess is now attacking the pawn on f5 with the queen, rook and bishop, and Stockfish is able to absorb this attack with the bishop, queen and rook. If you allow the knight to sneak into e3, then Stockfish would be in trouble. For this very reason, Stockfish had queen g6 and yet trusts Stockfish to find a deviation to this initiative against him. Stockfish came up with this answer. If you immediately try in this position, this knight jump, it would be Rubichess the engine in trouble. Can we work out why? It's because it falls short by a single move. If you attack the queen, queen f4, and rook b8, even if you take and take, and if again take, take, and take, how far would this queen attack get you? Doesn't this drop the pawn on c5? It does, but even if you take, this rook attack after the queen will hurt. Queen f2, and this simple attack with f4, and Rubichess falls apart. If you take, and you have to, once you take with the rook from the back rank, this would be basically it. We are interested to see what happened right after this push to c5. Rubichess repositioned the rook into place and is looking to attack the queen on e7. But this was never going to be allowed. Stockfish charged after the queen, and rather than stick the rook into e7, it was the queen that took his place. c4 attacking the bishop led to the queens to depart. And though the bishop looks to be lost, Rubichess found the only way out. Can you see what the engine did? This is the move it went for. Rook b8, adding the pressure, resulted to this brand new attack on the rook, and some pieces were going to depart very fast. Stockfish repositioned the rook here. Another 2 rooks came off. And in this point in time, we have just covered 1/3 of the game. As things stand, Stockfish is up by a single pawn, and there is a rook versus a rook, 2 bishops against a bishop and a knight, and in addition to all this, Rubichess has a double pawn structure which sometimes prove useful. Any ideas how the engine tries to break through? It was via this blast on the queen side. It's a smashing initiative, but can we work out why? Why would an engine throw away a pawn, and what is the incentive? With 2 pawn on the f-file, Rubichess's tactic is to squat the rook on the b-file and find his way into the game. So with rook b1, Stockfish rushed along with this pawn, and with the structure you see here, can these 2 pawns on the queen side, can they be of any danger? Another move Rubichess deemed essential was to go for this push on the king side. Though bishop e8 appears to work, after the knight finds his way into this outpost, any attempt to slot the rook into the heart of Rubichess's camp, this move can backfire automatically. Bishop e6 locking out or in this rook, can be catastrophic. If you try this avenue of play and remove this pawn with the idea of trading the bishops in on e6 and h5, if you trade, Stockfish will be having a field day. Rook a1, for example, will lead to this avenue of play, and even if you take and take, get rid of this pawn, get rid of this pawn too, and Stockfish would claim victory at this early point. So taking this pawn from h5 is not going to work, because there is another variation that we need to explore. Check this one out. Once you squeeze in this check, the tables turn and it will be Stockfish the engine playing catch up. King h7 is going to lead to a mate in 2. Take with a check. And once the bishop steps into cover, this is how you do it, and what a shame to lose in such a fashion. Coming back, Stockfish is a really sophisticated engine. This pawn on the queen side eventually finds the third, and alarm bells are already ringing. Knight f4 and try and create a nasty fork, resulted to the rook to back off. Rubichess finds the opportune moment to hunt after the rook. And what Rubichess does here is to mount all the pressure the engine can exert. It came in with a check. The king is forced to the 7th. Rubichess in turn attacks the rook, and when the rook repositioned to this outpost, though Rubichess could easily have removed this pawn from c4, the engine holds back. Because this pawn cannot actually be saved, Rubichess delays capturing him. The engine rushed after this pawn instead. Stockfish was calculating his best course of action. The mighty Stockfish chased after the knight. Rubichess uses both the knight and pawn to squeeze in this check. There goes the king to the very edge of the board. And this is how Rubichess seeks to level. This pawn eventually came off. And unless there is way to stop this knight, anyway, this pawn on h6 is on the cards next. And if it not this pawn on h6, what do you make of this helpless pawn on d6? And yet, believe it or not, Stockfish is the engine with all the surprises. What pawn would you think it covers, and why? The answer is neither. This is what the engine does. With Rubichess taking no prisoners, this pawn came flying off. Stockfish opts for this bishop repositioning, and how Rubichess reacts is quite aggressively. The bishop repositioning to e6 needs no explaining, because it is done to cover for the hanging pawn on c4. In the meantime, as soon as the knight made his way into this outpost, undoubtedly more pawns were on their way home. Stockfish returning the bishop to be able to at least be offered a chance to trade, but is this what happened? As soon as this pawn came off, any ideas how Stockfish reacts? This is what the engine does, and is now looking at least for a way to enforce a checkmate. Knight b5 led to this instant check. The king is forced to the first, and now via this brand new check. This is where the king ends up. When this pawn dropped, Rubichess charged after the bishop, and you are not going to guess how Stockfish reacts. Any ideas where this bishop went? The answer is nowhere. This is the move Stockfish applied, and is actually hoping for knight takes bishop on d5. A nice and neat way out is to just grab the pawn, but this would be a blunder. Can you see how? If you come in with this check, king f2, is going to lead to this renewed check. And if you now march with your king up the board, where would this follow-up check get you? King f2, repeat the checks, and once the king climbs up the board again, let's see how far this bishop repositioning gets you. Knight d5, take, and once this pawn finds the third, there are red flags everywhere. At this point we would need to come back to see how Rubichess and of course Stockfish calculated best to make progress. With the rook on h3 waiting to check the king and pick up the opposing rook, miraculously Rubichess does pick up the bishop, Stockfish does follow this one through with a check, and when the king found the second rank, Stockfish finally goes on to pick up the corner rook. This line, however, does not end here. With the removal of the bishop from d5 and the removal of the rook from the corner, Rubichess goes on to pick up the bishop on e7, and the engine looks to be ahead of Stockfish, certainly in terms of points. 1, 2, 3, 4 plus 6 equals 10 versus 1, 2, 3, 4, plus 5 for the rook equals 9. What was Stockfish thinking and why did the engine allow this sort of development? And this is why chess is such a fascinating game. Nearly always the bishop and knight are stronger than a lone rook, but can we be wrong with what we see here? This endgame picture is actually unique in every single sense. Stockfish at this stage was able to calculate a very fine and precise line where humans cannot dream of working out. In this light, this pawn on a5 made it to the fourth, Rubichess does the same thing with his own pawn, and now via this rook repositioning, it was what engine can run faster to promotion and sustain it. With Rubichess pushing on further, Stockfish attacked the pawn with the rook in this way. And should you now go d7? Not rook b8 but rook d6. Rook b8 leads to disaster. How? When the knight retreats to the last, the promotion is inevitable and Stockfish will get checkmated in just a handful of moves. So when this picture appeared, the knight still returned to the back rank to be able to hold on to the pawn, but the fate of this game is actually sealed. Can you see how? It's here by just taking this pawn can sacking the rook. If you now make it to the third, this pawn can no longer be stopped, and once he queens, Stockfish will not find it hard to end the game in his favor. Coming back to this position, Stockfish had calculated another way to get there even faster. The engine returned the rook to the seventh, the bishop had him immediately attacked. But via this rook repositioning, Stockfish was adamant he could inflict maximum damage. Rubichess in turn, could have attacked the rook again, but just remember to follow through what we saw in the variation we just went through. When this pawn is eliminated, you would not be able to capture the rook because this pawn on a4 no longer can be stopped. What you can do, however, is before taking the rook to take this pawn, but after rook f6. How would you stop this pawn on g4? You might be able to stop one pawn from promotion, but this pawn on g4 cannot be taken without giving up further material. Okay, now what we explored some what-ifs, Rubichess did not bother with the rook. The engine chased after this pawn on c4. Stockfish here attacks the knight, and only when the knight was forced to this outpost, this pawn finally came off. And in turn what Rubichess gains is this pawn on c4 too. And again, this endgame is type of unique. In terms of points when it comes to pawns, the picture is equal, and when it comes to the rook versus knight and bishop, Rubichess has 1 point more. Rook f6 by Stockfish resulted to the rook to come under fire, Stockfish retreats him to the back rank, and by cutting off the king from trying to reach the pawn on g4, this is how Rubichess plays it. So in essence, the pawn on a4 looks to be going nowhere, and the pawn on g4 looks to have the same fate. g3 saving the pawn, resulted to this bishop retreat, Stockfish gets to slip the pawn into the third, and with the bishop now actually forced to back off, Stockfish delivers this timely check. When the king found the first, Stockfish calculates the only way forward is to just start marching with his king. The king here is absolutely key, provided he remains on certain key squares. King g7 led to Rubichess to again retreat with the bishop. Stockfish once again marches with the king, but this time to the back rank. Rubichess has nothing else but to repeat. And now via this rook response, this pawn on h5 can no longer be saved. Stockfish got rid of him. Rubichess's king lashes after this pawn, but with this rook response, this knight had to go somewhere. Rubichess chose to move the king instead, but his fate was sealed. Stockfish has this incredible push to h5, but the engine doesn't bother. Can you see or try and figure out what the engine did? Stockfish appears to blunder here. The pawn was pushed to the brink of promotion, and with the knight capturing him, the idea was this. With the knight removed to one side of the board, Stockfish repositioned the rook behind the pawn. Rubichess retreats the bishop to be able to stop the pawn from making it further, but via this rook repositioning again, not knight e3, which was expectable, and not bishop b3. Bishop b3 in a blunder in its own right, but can you see why? It is very simple. Just hand over the rook and this pawn will queen. For this very reason, Rubichess marched again with this king. Stockfish in turn squeezes the rook on the second. And what follows next is such an atypical engine response. Rubichess calculated best to hand over the bishop for this king move, and when the bishop finally fell, Rubichess jumps the knight into the fourth. Rook a1 to allow the pawn to move resulted to this check, and this in fact is flagged as a blunder. King e7, and knight back to familiar territory, resulted to this rook repositioning, and the end was now quite near. With Rubichess choosing for this desperate move, it allowed Stockfish to find the second, and as soon as the knight made his next jump, the game was about to end soon. It doesn't matter where this knight goes. Knight b3 for example can either lead to this pawn on the king side to make progress. The second idea is to just promote, and when the queen is being picked up, Rubichess loses the knight to and 3. You can first pick up this knight by handing over the rook, and now you can make it to a brand new queen. Coming back to the game, Rubichess, an engine that played an outstanding game here, blunders again. The engine opted for this check, and when the king pursued this knight, the engine backed him off to the third. With Stockfish now queening, Rubichess enforces a last-minute check again. And when the king pursued him for yet another time, this is where the knight ends up. Queen d4 leads to a mate in 4, but there are so many other ways to do this too. Stockfish pushed on with his most powerful piece. The knight here backs off, but it was all down to Stockfish and how the engine terminates the game. It first took the knight with a check. The king pushes along, and now via this response, against any move there is a mate in 1. c3 attacking the queen, resulted to this simple checkmate, and this is how the game ended. Who could ever predict an endgame like this, and the way Stockfish found to end things in his favor? And with this, we have come to the end of today's video. And just to remind everyone who has tuned in, this is the only game in the Premier League so far where the engine with the white pieces loses a game. In the meantime, we hope you enjoyed, and look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.